Right, so we've introduced the idea of a heuristic, and the point I want you to pay attention to is that we need them, right? I'm going to be talking later about how they allow people to mislead us, so it sounds like they're a bad thing, but we can't do without them. But if you think about some heuristics from advertising, so for example, if it's natural, it's healthier, right? So very often for foodstuffs and medicines, you get this idea that, well, if something is natural, it must be better for you. Well, there's nothing more natural than botulism, right? There's nothing more natural than coronaviruses. I mean, they're part of nature, no doubt about it, but they're not green, wholesome nature. But actually, I mean, it could be that science has done some work on whatever it is that you're buying, and that you should buy the refined version. If it's healthier, it tastes horrible. So this is a heuristic that children rely on in choosing foods. If you tell a child that something is good for them, then it will put them off. Why? Well, because it is a pretty good rule, right? The things that are good for you tend to be less tasty than the things that you're already eating too much of. If it's expensive, it's better, right? So this is a heuristic we rely on when we are shopping in some market where we don't really know. So, buying wine. If you're not a regular wine drinker. Just now I was looking at photographic equipment. I don't know about cameras. So I'm kind of hoping that the heuristic that you get what you pay for will mostly hold up, and that if you buy something mid-range, it'll serve. There is some interesting research about wine, about how good experts are at identifying the expensive stuff. One that I think we all have to be aware of is that if somebody is well-spoken, or if they sound posh, the assumption is that they're going to be clever. Why? Well, if somebody sounds posh, you can probably safely assume that they've been expensively educated. So at the very least, it's got that, the heuristic has got that going for it. So they may have more facts available. They may have had more practice at certain kinds of elite problem solving. If your education takes place in small classes where every single day is debate society, and that you're not in a class of 40 where nobody gets to speak, then possibly your brain does get to be a bit more nimble, and you are better at thinking on your feet. But of course, it's not reliable, and there are expensively educated nincompoops, and there are also some people with very little education and very down market ways of speaking who are actually very smart. Of course there are, right? Nevertheless, we are all inclined to think that somebody talks a bit posh, then they're more likely to be clever. And we tend to rely on this in stressful situations, right? So if you go to the doctor, you're going to be reassured if the doctor sounds a bit posh. Or airline pilots. So if the plane's flying through turbulence, one of my favourites was the pilot comes on and says, "My mother wouldn't allow me to do this if it was in any way dangerous." It sounds very sort of old, and somehow that's reassuring. one of the, I think it's BA, but I'm not sure, one of the British Airlines, if it isn't actually British Airways, uses, I think, Leslie Phillips, who's a 20th century actor with a lovely, velvety and posh voice.
Hello.
To do the safety talk. Sounds as if he might be, one of those old wartime pilots. If you listen to David Niven in a film called A Matter of Life and Death.
Hello, June. Don't be afraid. It's quite simple. We've had it.
That kind of vibe. So when we're stressed, either at the doctor's or on a plane going through turbulence, we are comforted by a posh voice telling us that everything will be all right, even if we don't think of ourselves as snobs or would prefer not to think of ourselves as snobs. Another heuristic that we rely on is the idea that if there's a lot of words, there must be a good argument, right? This, I think, is part of what's going on if you have adverts in magazines or on the tube where there's just a wall of text. Are you supposed to read all this? Possibly not. Possibly you're only supposed to think, well, there's a lot of words, so they must have some kind of a case. So what advertising very often does is offers you a heuristic, right? Your brain wants a heuristic. It would very much like to be given a rule that would allow it to reach an answer very quickly. So of course, somebody who has an interest in your brain reaching one answer rather than another will do this by supplying your brain with a handy rule that just happens to have the right conclusion. Other heuristics we rely on? Well, if everybody agrees, it's probably true. This is our old friend social truth, which we met before. You remember my advice for how to survive a heart attack, right? The people standing around you will be relying on social truth to tell them what to do. And if they're all looking at each other and doing nothing, then they will do nothing. There was an interesting case where a British diplomat dived into a river in China to rescue a drowning student. And I wonder why he jumped in and nobody else did. Well, all the other people at the scene, I think, were all other Chinese tourists. And I don't think this is anything about being Chinese and being British. I think it may be just because being one thing rather than another. So social proof will work on people who are in some way similar. So the Chinese tourists are all looking at each other going, what are we going to do? Because the British diplomat maybe wasn't as susceptible to social proof because he was a British person in China, jumped in. We would need to do the experiment, right? We need to get a Chinese diplomat by a river in Britain and throw in a student and see what happens. Okay. If the source is disinterested or independent, it's probably true, right? The message is probably true. Why? Well, it's a good rule because scientists are supposed to be disinterested. Remember the difference between disinterested and uninterested. If I'm doing disinterested research, I very much want to know what the answer is, but I haven't placed a bet. Okay? So I want to know whether or not badgers can see in colour, right? So I do some experiment. I very much want to know, but I don't really care which answer I get as long as I get the answer. That's disinterested research. Uninterested research is where if I really don't, I don't want to know whether badgers can see in colour, but somebody's paying me to do it, so I guess I'll do it, right? That would be uninterested. Disinterested research is good. So, and we know this, right? So if if the source of a claim seems to be disinterested, then we're more likely to agree with it, which is, of course, is why all of these think tanks have names like, the Institute of Relevant Social Studies, or the Institute of Socioeconomic Affairs or something, right? So they just sound like some bland research institute, when in fact, very often they're paid for by donors with a political axe to grind. Okay. If the speaker is confident, then the case is more likely to be sound, right? Confidence convinces. And that's why people do media training, right? So that if you go on the telly or the radio and somebody asks you a question, you don't go, well, let's see. This is why experts very often do badly on talk radio. Professor of virology goes on some talk radio show, and the host says, "Professor, why do you want to ruin the economy?" And it's like, what? Professor, will this vaccine get us back to normal life by March of next year? And the professor will think, well, there are 3 different answers I could give, which are all true, but come in varying grades of technicality. Let me see. This is a radio audience. They're not stupid, but they're not experts. Maybe I should give the one that I would give to, not to beginning undergraduates, but maybe to 6th formers, right? By the time your expert has thought all that, they've looked hesitant because they are hesitating. Media training teaches you not to do that. Media training teaches you to figure out who your audience are and get your message sorted so that you don't hesitate, right? If the end is virtuous, then the argument is probably sound. So one of the problems that big tobacco had early on was persuading women to smoke. Persuading men to smoke cigarettes was easy. They just gave them to soldiers in the First World War. This was in the States. So when the US joined the First World War, the tobacco companies gave them, previously men smoked pipes and cigars. But if you give soldiers cigarettes, they'll smoke them, right? They're free tobacco. Once soldiers were smoking cigarettes, that was it, and that was easy. Men smoked cigarettes after that. How do you persuade women to smoke cigarettes? Well, the person who worked this out was a guy called Bernays, Edward Bernays, who coincidentally was Sigmund Freud's nephew. And Edward Bernays invented public relations and advertising, pretty much, by asking himself whether anything that Uncle Sigmund had discovered would be useful for selling stuff. So basically, Eddie Bernays took psychoanalysis, or the approach, the idea that we're not rational creatures, we are, each of us is a seething mass of fears and needs and unmet desires. Speak to that rather than doing features and benefits advertising that says, buy our toothpaste because it will make your teeth healthier. That's boring. So what Eddie Bernays did was he made smoking into a feminist issue. And they organized stunts, and at one point they had a kind of march demonstration with women bearing lighted cigarettes aloft as torches of freedom. Right? Well, freedom's a good thing. Women's lib is a good thing. So surely they should be allowed to smoke in public. Right? Or even encouraged. Okay. The last one I want to mention is the heuristic that if you came to the idea yourself, then you'll believe it. Another wartime problem was, how do you persuade people to eat the whole animal? How do you persuade people to eat the less attractive bits of the animal, like the offal, the heart and the like? Well, you could just tell them. Obviously, this was addressed to housewives because this is the 1940s, and gender understanding was where it was then. So you could go, housewives, there's a war on, there's a shortage of food. For pity's sake, please, 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 buy, cook, and serve offal, bits of the less attractive bits of meat. But that's kind of hectoring, that's finger wagging, that's telling people their own business. Far better to let them think that it's their own. So what you do is you run focus groups. You invite housewives in, and you say, ladies, we have a problem. The government has a problem. We need your help. We want you to think about, how can we get food supplies to go further? And you set the problem up, and you give them the facts. You invite them to draw their own conclusions. And there is, it's really obvious. If there's a shortage of food, eat the whole animal. Don't give the boring bits to the dogs. Turn the boring bits of the animal into pies and sausages. It's obvious. So you could rely on people coming to the right answer. But because people came to the answer themselves, they believe it, they're committed to it, and they feel it must be true. Okay. So those are some kind of examples of heuristics that you will find persuasion professionals using. In the next little bit, I'm going to talk a bit more about the science, about the heuristics that Kahneman and Tversky investigated.